Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy. Mains 2024 Gender Studies Paper 1 Analysis. And remember, you all knew that yesterday we have discussed some questions which were asked in Gender Studies Paper 1. And in this session, we will be discussing few more questions in Gender Studies Paper 1. Remember, I have told you that if you look at the syllabus of UPSC Gender Studies Paper 1 mains examination, so it consists of Indian art and culture, Indian history, particularly the modern Indian history, and also the Indian freedom struggle, world history, Indian society, and geography, Indian geography, world geography, physical geography, and even climate change. So all these are the most important topics of Gender Studies Paper 1 and world history as well, right? So today we have one question. We'll start this discussion with this question. Question is about migration. And in India, migration is one of the most crucial, most important phenomenon that we all knew about it, because in India there is a very often that the intrastate migration or interstate migration has been taking place. The reason being is rural areas are not able to create adequate employment opportunities, and very often people from rural areas are migrating to urban areas in search of employment, better living standards, including education and healthcare, etc. So in this context, the question is about why do large cities tend to attract more migrants than smaller towns? And second part of the question, discuss in the light of conditions in developing countries. And India is a developing country, and most of the countries in the global south are developing countries. And the very same phenomenon that is asked in the question can be seen or can be observed in most of the countries in the global south, that most of the migration has been taking from most of the migration in these developing countries has been to the the larger towns or large cities instead of the smaller towns in those respective countries. For example, in India, when we say large cities, Delhi is a large city, Mumbai, Bengaluru, Hyderabad, Kolkata, Chennai. So these are large cities. We all knew that these large cities have been attracting more migrants compared to the smaller towns, because in each of these different states there are number of smaller towns as well, and they are not necessarily metropolitan cities. But why these smaller towns are not attracting more and more number of migrants like the larger cities? So that is the key demand of the question, and we need to discuss this keeping in mind the developing countries in the global south. So therefore, what should be the approach for this question? And if you look at the approach for this question, so first and foremost, you have to discuss migration, and you could also write some data with respect to migration in India or any other developing countries, and then a type of migration which is seen in developing countries, you could write this. And in the second part of the question, you need to discuss the pull factors of migration towards larger cities, and then you need to discuss push factors away from the small towns in developing countries. And finally, you have to conclude the answer by government action towards migrants, or how could we address the problem of migration. Now, migration is not a problem for any country if it is properly managed, but in India or any other developing countries in the global south, migration usually takes place from rural areas to the urban areas. But urban areas in developing countries very often have poor infrastructure. Because of poor infrastructure, they are not able to accommodate more and more migrant population in those urban areas or large cities, and that would lead to the poor development, poor growth of these urban centers and also the growth of slums in these urban areas. So we are going to discuss this in a very detailed manner so that you could understand the basic nuances of this particular question. So as I have already emphasized, when we talk about the migration, you have to give a brief introduction about migration. So you could define migration. So it is very simple. When we say migration, it is just the movement of people from one place to another place, right? So just people move from one place to another place and they would settle in a new location, and that would be, in a very simple term, is considered as migration. However, when we talk about migration, migration can be either voluntary or involuntary in nature, and in fact migration can also takes place because of a multitude of reasons. And we all knew that economic reason is one of the most dominant reason for the migration of people from rural areas to urban areas. And apart from migration, there were environmental reasons, social reasons, and several other reasons which drive people out of a place where they belong to a different place. However, a demographic and economic migration is specifically related to poor labor standards, high unemployment in those respective countries or cities, and overall health of country's economy. Now, when I say migration, migration is two different types. I hope all of you knew about these two different types of migration. So one is two different factors influences migration. One is pull factors and other is push factors. So these pull factors and push factors are the major reasons or the factors which usually determine the nature of migration in any country. So first and foremost, we'll talk about the pull factors and how pull factors contribute to migration from rural areas to urban areas, and why people don't settle in smaller towns, why they choose to settle or why they choose to migrate to larger cities in India or any other developing country for that matter. Now, in fact, when we say about the pull factors, people usually gets attracted by the better living standards, economic conditions, employment opportunities, education and healthcare facilities. And those factors which attract people from rural areas or smaller towns, so that kind of a migration is known as a pull based migration or migration which is influenced by the pull factors. For suppose in large cities, now we all knew that in India cities are known as the growth engines, the economic growth engines. Major industries are located in cities. Service sector rapidly grows in those cities because of its larger presence, and it provides a huge employment opportunities for the people instead of smaller towns, right? So in fact, when you look at the wages in smaller towns and larger cities have, they usually offer higher wages for the people, and there are always better employment opportunities because of large scale presence of the service sector in these larger cities, and there are a lot of industries located in these larger cities in India or any other developing country, and high standard of living for the people, and even strong economic growth and remittances. And these are certain economic factors which make people attracted towards the larger cities instead of settling in smaller towns in developing countries. And there is also a large difference in terms of education infrastructure and healthcare infrastructure in smaller towns and also the larger cities. In larger cities, there is a better education, a quality education I could say, and a better healthcare facilities as well. And in fact, a better learning institutions, top quality education, and higher educational opportunities compared to the smaller towns attract people migrate towards these larger cities. And education would also be a pull factor in migration, and healthcare, better medical care, access to good health and services would also be the other factors which usually attract people. Now you can you can make an assessment of yourself from your state itself. You have many small towns in your respective state. Instead of people migrating to those small towns, there are metropolitan cities in your respective states. People prefer to migrate to those metropolitan cities or larger cities in those respective states because of the better economic opportunities offered by those larger cities, because of the existing infrastructure and healthcare, education, and even the political and religious freedom that people enjoy in those larger cities compared to the rural areas or the smaller towns. Because in these larger towns there would be no strict social stratification, there would be no caste system, there would be no regulations, so people can easily practice their political and religious freedom in these large big metropolitan cities. And that would be the another reason, and that could be another pull factor of migration. And better living conditions and employment or enjoyment or any other entertainment purposes, so all these are the pull factors which attract a lot of people into the larger cities instead of the smaller towns. And even there is also a better transportation, communication networks, and a family links, and better chances of marrying, everything. So these are all pull factors which attract people to come and settle in larger cities instead of small towns. Now there is a huge difference between the smaller towns and the larger cities when it comes to the infrastructure that we have just discussed. The wage difference in living standards, and also there's a difference in quality of education, quality of healthcare that people usually receive, and there is a huge difference in the standard of living of the people. And there is no guarantee that people who are migrated to the smaller towns would get the employment necessarily based on their qualification. So all these are the reasons for people preferring the larger cities instead of smaller towns. And apart from that, there are certain push factors which push the people from away from these smaller towns or rural areas into the larger cities. Now what are those push factors? Remember, migration is influenced by two factors. So one category of factors are push factors and another category of factors are pull factors. So we have just discussed the pull factors, and now we'll look into the push factors as well. So push factors included the socio-political, economic, and the ecological factors in these smaller towns or the rural areas, which very often force people in those smaller towns and rural areas to migrate the larger cities. Now when we say the economic factors, so what could be the economic factors which force people out of the smaller towns or rural areas to migrate to larger cities? For example, unemployment, which is widely prevalent in those smaller towns, and lower wages would be the another major reason. Lower wages, unemployment, and also poor living standards of the people. Poor living standards would be another reason. So these could be the economic reasons. And when I say the ecological reasons, we cannot say that ecological reasons instead of ecological reasons. So we could also say that in recent times climate change is increasing the intensity and frequency of number of disasters. So in order to mitigate or in order to escape from the worst impacts of those disasters, people have been migrating out of the smaller towns and rural areas and settling in these urban areas, and those people are known as the climate refugees. So they are known as the climate refugees. And in fact, in majority of India's smaller towns and also in rural areas in recent times, we used to see the ethnic conflicts. Apart from ethnic conflicts, there were also very often communal incidents communal incidents and ethnic conflicts, and these were also the major push factors. They are pushing people out of these areas, and violence and political unrest which is prevalent in different parts, and significant economic disparities which have been existing. People don't have adequate money, adequate income in their hands, and foods insecurity that people have been facing, and unreliable access to clean drinking water, lack of adequate education, employment opportunities, human rights abuses that people facing, and lack of freedom and expression. So this is not just with respect to India, rather this is a common phenomenon across all developing countries. And worsening climate that leads to the climate refugee problem, unstable governments mostly in African and Latin American countries, and lack of job opportunities for the people, and poor quality healthcare. So all these things are the major reasons that people have been migrating from the rural areas to the urban areas, particularly the metropolitan cities. Now in fact, when we talk about the rural areas and even plus the smaller towns, so there is no bigger difference between the rural areas and smaller towns in terms of infrastructure, in terms of development, in terms of presence of service sector, and even industries. So therefore, people, instead of preferring these smaller towns, they have been preferring the large cities or metropolitan cities. And as of now, these metropolitan cities are being congested because of the excess population migration into these larger metropolitan cities. However, during COVID-19 pandemic, what happened? So we have observed a reverse migration during the COVID-19 pandemic, where people from these large cities and even other different towns started migrating back to the rural areas. So that phenomenon is known as the reverse migration. However, since the lockdown was lifted, people again started going back to these large cities. So therefore, it is very important that cities are recognized as a growth engines, as rightly pointed out by ICER Judge Ahluwalia Committee. And in this context, it is very important that the holistic and inclusive development of Indian cities, particularly the metropolitan cities, is also very important, and government could also undertake certain measures in those rural areas, and they could arrest migration, or incentivizing people in rural areas would ensure that the migration would be arrested, because migration is not bad in its nature, but as of now the larger cities are not able to accept more and more migrants because of the poor infrastructure, poor performance of the urban local bodies in those larger cities. So therefore, for example, Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, so this is the one way which provides, through which the government has been providing income security. And government can actually announce a lot of incentives, and that would disincentivize people to migrate to those large cities. For example, there are a lot of opportunities in elite sectors of the agriculture, such as dairy farming is one method. Dairy farming, poultry farming, apiculture, sericulture, aquaculture. So there were number of opportunities, and we need to create a large scale employment opportunities in rural areas and smaller towns, and we need to further promote entrepreneurship among youth and young population in rural small rural areas and towns. And at the same time, when we talk about the entrepreneurship in those rural areas, women entrepreneurship should be the key focus area, right? So migration, when we talk positively about migration would help in achieving developmental goals, and migration would also supply the necessary or the required workforce in the larger cities which have been expanding at a faster pace, and the infrastructure of those large cities has also been developing at a faster pace over a period of time. And in fact, policies and programs should actually make the migration more and more it would be easier for the migrants to settle in the new communities in those large cities, because whenever people migrate from rural areas, small towns to these large cities, so they live in conditions which are there's no proper sanitation, there's no proper hygiene in those areas, and in fact most of the people settle themselves in urban slums. So therefore it would be government could have to make it easier for the migrants to go and settle in their new communities, and government can also come up with PM Awas Yojana schemes, etc. And government can provide a decent housing, fair wages, safety for the migrant workers, and which is very very important, and support programs such as health insurance, child care, so they can be helpful in this regard. And that's how you can actually conclude this particular answer. And next question, it is a very simple and very easy question. The question is, what is the phenomenon of cloudburst, and explain. And now if you carefully look at this paper, this particular question, so this question is based out of recent incidents of cloudbursts which took place in the states of Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh. And cloudbursts have become a very common phenomenon in India, and climate change has also increased its intensity and the frequency of these cloudbursts, and cloudbursts have also been triggering large scale landslides which have been leading to the loss of lives and even the loss of property or damages to the property. And recently we have seen the Wayanad landslides to some extent that can also be associated with the cloudbursts. Now in this context, we will understand what are these cloudbursts and what are the reasons for these cloudbursts, and what are the negative impact of cloudbursts, and how we could usually mitigate this negative impact of the cloudbursts. So this is how you have to properly structure this answer. And remember, structuring of the answer is very very important. That ensures that you have addressed the demand of the question, the answer is coherent and comprehensive, and it also helps you score very good marks in your answer, right? So I have already explained this approach of this question. Let's get into this question and we'll discuss about this. Now what is cloudburst? In the introduction you just start with the definition of the cloudburst, and that would be enough. Remember, it is 150 word answer. In 150 word answer you have to make sure, or you will be given just 2 pages only. You have to write answer in only 2 pages. So therefore make sure that you address the key demand of the question in that 2 papers, and avoid writing irrelevant content in the answer. And also remember that whenever you write answers from geography portion, it would always be better to write or draw some diagrams, so that would also further enhance or enrich your answer, helps you get more marks. So remember, as I have already told you, that when you are writing an answer on cloudbursts, you briefly write what are these cloudbursts. Cloudbursts are intense bursts with extreme rainfall, and these cloudbursts are very often localized in nature, right? So they are localized in nature. And in fact, when we talk about the cloudbursts, a large amount of water is dumped in a very short period of time at a particular location, right? So for example, imagine that a particular area or particular village, or even an area which is a 10 square kilometers, and in that particular area a large amount of water would be dumped in a very shorter period of time, and that would trigger flash floods, that would trigger landslides, and that would lead to the loss of lives and damage to the properties. And in recent times the incidents of cloudbursts have been increasing across India, right? So in fact, these cloudbursts sometimes accompanied by thunderstorms and even hailstorms as well, and in fact it is quite common in India's mountainous states. Now what are those mountainous states? Such as Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Sikkim. In those mountainous states these cloudbursts are very common phenomenon. Also remember, in recent times Western Ghats and the mountainous regions of Western Ghats have also been it has also been observing the increased incidence of these cloudburst phenomenon, and they have also been triggering floods and even landslides as well. So we will understand the occurrence of the cloudburst. Now how do these cloudbursts usually occur? So remember that these are very important questions, and there is also a higher probability of UPSC asking these questions multiple number of times. So therefore you have to be very careful when you are reading about cloudburst. You have to understand things. So when you get to understand things, you can also reproduce the answer in the question paper, right? So occurrence of cloudburst. Now how cloudbursts usually occur over a period or over a particular region, that we will understand very briefly, right? So cloudburst, a phenomenon, occur initially when moisture laden clouds, we all knew that very often clouds have moisture laden, there are certain moisture laden clouds also. So these moisture laden clouds, they do not cause any rainfall due to the upward movement of extremely hot air. For example, imagine that a particular area used to get intense heat, and intense heat of that particular area would result in the more aggressive upward movement of extremely hot air currents. And due to this extreme nature of hot currents, the air in the moisture in these clouds do not condense, and that would not result in the rainfall. However, due to this hot air current, so the upward movement of this hot air current, the raindrops become bigger in size, right? So because of regularly these moisture laden winds and the moisture in these clouds has been increasing moisture results in the raindrops becoming bigger over a period of time. Because of a regular supply of hot air or warmer nature, so generally we all knew that when these clouds cools down, then only it would condense, and condensation would ensure the rainfall over a particular area. But the hot air movement, the upward hot air movement would not let these clouds cool down, would not let these clouds to condense and then precipitate. So over a period of time, the clouds and the moisture in those clouds becoming bigger in size, the raindrops becoming bigger in size. So instead of falling down, they continue to move up. These clouds continue to move up because of the pressure from the hot air upward movement. And in fact, there will be a high humidity in the atmosphere and high humidity in those clouds as well. So high humidity and low temperatures because the hot upward movement of hot air pushing these clouds further upwards, and we all knew that with increasing height, with increasing altitude, temperature drops. So when temperature drops, and that would result in slow wind speeds, and that would finally results in cools down these clouds cools down, and that would result in condensation of clouds at a lightning speed. And warm air below these clouds restricts the falling of the water from these clouds, and over a time moisture level in these clouds becomes so big that it would be not possible for these clouds to hold the moisture. So therefore suddenly the all the moisture or bigger raindrops come down as a severe spell of torrential rain in a very limited geographical area within minutes, and that's how these cloud bursts are usually triggered. And in fact, one of the major reasons or major causes of the cloud burst would be the formation of these cumulonimbus clouds. Now, cumulonimbus clouds trigger the formation of cloudbursts on a large scale. Now, what are the consequences of the cloudburst? We need to understand the consequences of the cloudburst. So when we talk about the consequences, the most visible effect of the cloudburst would be landslides. Now, when the downpour of the rain because of the cloud burst would be higher, and when this downpour fall on the slope of a mountain, and that would easily trigger a large scale landslides. And large scale landslide means that they can change the course of the rivers and flooding of the nearby areas. So all the things can usually takes place because of these cloud bursts. So rapid downward movement of huge mountain landmass would be termed as a landslide, and it would result in loss of life, and it also impacts the vehicle traffic movement also, because that would block the roads, that would block the river channels, and because of the heavy rainfall the water generally enters into the nearby villages, nearby towns, flooding those areas, and even a lot of people would be damage to the property, damage to the infrastructure, and that would also leading to a lot of people losing their lives. And it would also trigger mudslides, and they are also very common effect of these cloud bursts. And it is rapid flow of debris and dirt which gets stronger and further liquefied with the addition of the fast moving water, and that would be triggered by these cloud bursts. And in fact, the natural disasters are not only the natural disaster which are being triggered by the cloud bursts, such as mudslides, landslides, are not only harmful for the human beings, and they can even destroy the rich flora and fauna of these mountainous regions such as Western Ghats and Himalayas in that particular region. And in fact, these mudslides, landslides, cloud bursts and natural disaster which are being triggered by these cloud bursts would result in a large swaths of forest gets flooded, a large number of animals would also die, and trees would also get uprooted. And landslide or land subsidence is also one of the major consequences of cloud bursts. And land subsidence means rapid and sudden sinking of or settling of Earth's surface. So these are the consequences of landslides. And apart from this, as cities and villages and even towns gets destroyed by these natural disasters, another major impact that one can see is the large scale migration of human beings. Remember, in the first question we have discussed about the migration, particularly the climate induced or climate driven migration. They were also known as climate refugees. So when their houses are being destroyed, infrastructure is being destroyed, and those regions are regularly vulnerable to those natural disasters, people would start migrating from those regions to the safer places, and they are known as the climate refugees. So it could be interstate migration, and it could also be the inter-country migration as well. And therefore it becomes challenging for the governments to rehabilitate a large or huge displaced population in a very short span of time. And there's also one example which is given. Now there was a cloud burst near the Amarnath shrine in Uttarakhand, and Amarnath shrine in Jammu and Kashmir, that was occurred in Pahalgam area on the route of Sri Amarnath shrine in Jammu and Kashmir, which saw at least 8 casualties. Right, so these cloud bursts were very common in Jammu and Kashmir, Uttarakhand, Himachal Pradesh, Sikkim, and even the Western Ghats region as well. Now in this context, what should be the plausible way forward to address these cloud burst and negative impact associated to the consequences associated with these cloud bursts? So climate change and cloud bursts are very often interlinked with each other, and we will be witnessing cloud bursts more frequently with higher intensity in the future. So therefore, central and respective state governments should work proactively, and they should also invest in research and development for better weather monitoring and also timely warning of such events. Right, so that's how you could also write a way forward. And in fact, it would be very difficult, or even we cannot predict these natural disasters. It would be very difficult, particularly cloud burst. It is not easy to predict cloud burst because they can form at any place at a very short span of time. So because of that reason, it would be very difficult for us to predict those cloud bursts, and there are several steps that can be taken, that can be initiated to mitigate the loss of life and even property. So that includes introduction of modern and advanced flood warning systems in those risk areas, afforestation, and use of scientific farming methods to reduce its impact, and also constructing homes in a way that is able to withstand such events. So all these things can be done, and that would help in mitigation of the consequences or the negative consequences associated with these cloud bursts. Now when you write such a way forward with some suggestions, it makes your answer holistic and also comprehensive as well. And next question which is asked in the paper this year is about a new term which is demographic winter. And I think many of the aspirants who were writing this year mains examination, they may not be able to they don't know about the term demographic winter. So if you don't know the term, it would be very difficult to answer this question. And most of the students knew about the demographic dividend, but demographic winter is a new term. Right, so question is, what is a concept of demographic winter, and is the world moving towards such a situation? Elaborate. Now if you even knew the definition of demographic winter, you can answer this question without any doubt, and you could also score a very good marks. Now when I say demographic winter, it is very closely associated with the phenomenon of declining birth rates across the world. Okay, so the phenomenon of declining birth rates. So across the world, we have been seeing declining birth rates, and in fact when we discuss this situation in the context of India, in India also we already achieved the replacement level fertility rate. So the fertility rate, the overall fertility rate would hover around 2.0 to 2.1 in India, but in urban areas it is around 1.8, but in rural areas it would be slightly higher. So we have already achieved the replacement level fertility rate. So that essentially means that we are going to achieve the population stabilization in 1, 2 or 3 decades. Population stabilization would be achieved. Okay, so it is fine that we are going to become a country with the population stabilization. Now what is this declining birth rate? Right, so in order to control population, a number of countries have taken number of measures so that they can control the birth rate. For example, China has followed one child policy. So one child policy of China, so which encourages only one child for the parents. Right, so disincentivizing or not encouraging two child was the basic objective of this one child policy. Now this one child policy has led to the drastic decline in birth rates in China, and China is now becoming an aging economy. And not just China, so this policy was followed in China alone, but due to development that those countries have achieved, increasing literacy rates, and societies becoming more and more individualistic, matured, so it has led to people not favoring more than one kid, and even young populations were not interested to marry. So all these things have led to the declining birth rate, and countries such as Japan, South Korea, Italy, and even Scandinavian countries, Nordic countries, have been experiencing the aging economies. Aging economies in the sense that now they have a very limited number of young people, but they have a huge old age people who are dependent on the government, who are dependent on the services, or the contribution of the younger people in those respective countries, right? So that is overall a term is demographic dividend. So approach for this question, so approach is that first and foremost you have to introduce what is demographic dividend, or you could define this term what is demographic dividend, and then discuss the reasons for the demographic winter, and then countries experiencing demographic winter, you could write those respective countries, and then discuss the impact of demographic winter on the society, and then ultimately you need to conclude this answer. So remember, as I have already told you, this question you should briefly introduce with a demographic winter. So what is demographic winter? So demographic winter refers to a situation where the birth rate falls significantly, or there would be a significant decline in the birth rate below the replacement level, right? So what is this replacement level? In the beginning of this particular answer, I have also told you in the context of India that we have already achieved the replacement level. Now what is this replacement level? Now remember, there are two parents, parent A and parent B. So if these two parents have two kids, then that would be considered as replacement level, because two parents were replaced by two kids. So that is a replacement level, and this would lead to the population stabilization. So if these two parents have three kids, we cannot say that this replacement level fertility rate. So therefore, below the replacement level would be considered as the demographic winter. And in fact, the phenomenon of demographic winter over a period of time would lead to the aging population, shrinking workforce, and even it would lead to the economic challenges for the people as well. Now, what are the reasons for the demographic winter in India? So we'll look into these, not just in India, now across the world. Now what are the reasons for this demographic winter as a phenomenon? Now countries with low religious observance see low birth rates and even higher abortion rates as well. And in fact, heavy consumption taxes those heavy consumption taxes also discourage investment in human capital, and they can also contribute to the demographic winter as well. Now apart from that, there are certain reasons. For example, the policies followed by these countries, we could mention the one child policy of China. One child policy of China that was followed, increasing literacy rates. Societies are becoming individualistic in nature, right? So more and more individualistic, more and more aspirational, both men and women. So that would be another reason that they're not getting married. And apart from that, families have been becoming or transforming into nuclear families from earlier joint family. So joint family system was widely prevalent in India, but due to globalization, families have also been becoming nuclear families. And the development that those respective countries in Europe and other developed countries that they have achieved, and advancements in the field of healthcare, advancements in the field of healthcare. So all these things over a period of time have led to the significant decline in the birth rates, and that would be a phenomenon which is known as the demographic winter. So according to the Lancet study by Institute of Health and Metrics and Evaluation, so world's population will peak around 2064, right? So that would be the year where world's population would reach highest 9.7 billion, and from that particular year onwards the global population would start declining because of the demographic winter, which is the falling birth rate, or significant decline in the birth rate. So now what are those countries which have been experiencing the demographic winter phenomenon? For example, South Korea as a country which has been experiencing the lower levels of the birth rate. South Korea was considered to be the country which has been experiencing the coldest demographic winter because of the severe decline in the birth rates in those respective countries. And Italy, the working age population in Italy has already shrunk by 2 million people in the last 10 years, and in fact it is also projected to shrink by another 2 million in the next 10 years as well. And in Europe, many countries in southern and eastern Europe such as Austria, Germany, Russia, so those respective countries also have a lower levels of fertility rates. A country named Uruguay in the South America recorded more deaths than births for the first time. So these are the countries which have been experiencing the demographic winter, and because of that particular reason, the younger population in these countries has been declining at a faster pace, and the old age population has been increasing. So increasing old age population or declining the younger population would make those respective countries would not have adequate workforce to sustain their economic activities. The governments would not have adequate the tax revenues to finance infrastructure development, finance healthcare, finance education, social welfare, so all those things. So that would be certainly a problem for any country. And what would be the impact of demographic winter on society? We need to look into this, right? So firstly, aging population. The percentage of elderly population or people who are older would increase substantially, and that could lead to the higher dependency ratio on healthcare, pensions, and even the social welfare systems as well. And there is also shrinking workforce. So when we talk about the shrinking workforce, a smaller labor force can lead to the economic growth reduction, labor shortages, and increased taxation burdens on the younger generations as well. So this would be another major problem with the demographic winter or declining birth rates of any country. And in fact, there will not be adequate workforce to sustain the economic activity of that respective country. And though when countries do not have the adequate workforce, so that would result in declining the tax revenues for the government, and government would not be able to service its obligations with respect to defense, social welfare, health, education, and all these problems would increase for those respective countries. And there are a number of social economic consequences because of the declining fertility rates. And countries which have been facing the demographic winter need proactive policies such as encouraging higher birth rates. So they need to immediately give impetus to encourage increase the birth rate, so that the younger population would increase over a period of time. Countries would come out of the phenomenon of demographic winter and promote immigration, and they should also invest in automation, because they will not have adequate workforce to sustain their economic activities. And in fact, the government should also provide certain incentives for the married couple as well. So married couple and having children, so that would incentivize people, that would encourage people to get into this marital relationship and also have kids. So empowering women and girls and even encouraging migration, all these measures have to be undertaken. So to immediately come out of the problem, we cannot say that immediately, but rather these are a long term suggestions. So if the governments implement those suggestions, it would be possible that the world may come out of this demographic winter, right? And they could also sustain their economies in the longer periods of time. So next important question, this is also very important. So this question is from the society section in Gender Studies paper 1. The question is, distinguish between gender equality, gender equity and also women empowerment, and write why it is important to take gender concerns into account in program design and implementation. And this is the question. And this question is about women and particularly Indian society, because Indian society is part of Gender Studies paper 1 of UPSC. So therefore, first and foremost, we'll try to structure this answer. We'll try to have a proper framework. In the framework, you just introduce terms gender equality, gender equity and women empowerment. In the next part of the answer, you just distinguish between the gender equality, gender equity and also women empowerment. And then in the third part of the answer, you just mention the importance of considering concerns into account in programs design and implementation, and ultimately you need to conclude the answer. So this is how you can structure the answer. You can develop a framework for this particular question, right? So now you have to briefly define the terms. What does it means when we say gender equality? So gender equality usually means equal outcomes for women, men and even gender diverse people. So that equality in literal sense for women, men and even the transgender communities, right? So that is gender equality. But when it comes to the gender equity, so gender equity is the process to achieve the gender equality. So this is the process through which the gender equality can be achieved, that the men, women and transgender communities would be equal, right? So that would be, so for example, gender equity demands affirmative action for the woman, right? So there would be a certain policy specifically for women, and that would result in the gender equality. And gender equity even recognizes that women are vulnerable, women are disadvantaged communities, and not just women and even transgender people, they are not in the same starting position as men. So this is what the gender equity very often advocates. And there is one reason for that, because women and transgender or gender diverse people have faced certain historical as well as the social disadvantages, and because of that reason, women and transgender people are not in this same starting position as men. So this is what the gender equity believes in. However, so in fact, gender equity create further disadvantage. In fact, it can create further disadvantage. So this gender equality, or making men, women and transgender people are in the same starting point. So gender equity measures are often needed to level the playing field. Now, when we talk about the woman empowerment as a definition, so woman empowerment is the promotion of woman's sense of self-worth, empowering women, or ensuring that women are able to take decisions on their own, or enhancing their decision-making power and their ability to determine their own choices and their right to influence the social change for themselves and even others, and they deciding important outcomes, important decisions in their respective in their respective families. So all these things forms part of the woman empowerment. And in fact, it is rightly said that empowering a man leads to empowering an individual, but empowering a woman empowers the entire generation, and therefore it is very, very important that we have to remember. So then you could write, you could have a brief graph about you, because the question itself asked you to distinguish or differentiate between gender equality, gender equity, as well as the woman empowerment, right? So when we talk about the gender equality, so gender equality clearly says that all genders, men, women, transgender, are equal. They are having same rights, they are having same responsibilities, and also the same opportunities. So this is what the gender equality talks about. So a literal equality in the literal sense. And in fact, gender equality also believes that men, women enjoy same rights across all sectors of society, including economic participation, decision making, and in fact it also says men and women are equally valued and as favored as well. However, so when we talk about the gender equity, so gender equity focuses on fairness and justice. It recognizes the historical and social disadvantages that women have been facing in the society. And gender equity also emphasizes that women may require different support, women require encouragement, support, hand-holding support, and affirmative action and certain policies. And women should be provided a special opportunities so that they could tap their potential and they can also overcome their historical and social disadvantages that they have been facing throughout the centuries. And gender equity also employs a targeted measures to achieve the desired outcomes as well. Now after that we have to talk about the women empowerment. Now when we talk about the women empowerment, it is a process wherein women gain power, they control their own lives, and they also acquire the ability to make choices. For example, a recent example would be Nari Shakti Vandana Abhiyan, where 33% of the reservation has been provided for the women in the Lok Sabha and state legislative assemblies, particularly to empower women politically. And apart from that, at the local bodies, 33% of the reservation for women has already been provided by the 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment Acts, and these legislative measures primarily aimed at empowering women politically. And women empowerment also enables women to recognize their self-worth. They can access the opportunities that they have, the resources that they have access to, and also their ability to influence direction of social change as well. Now, what is the importance of considering concerns into account in programs and design implementation? So first and foremost, we need to talk about the gender budgeting. You may have heard about the gender budgeting. So gender budgeting is concerned with the gender sensitive formulation of legislation, programs, and even schemes. Now gender budgeting especially means that there would be certain prioritized programs for women, schemes for women. A certain portion of the budget would be allocated for those schemes by to make sure that women are prioritized in those respective programs. So allocation of resources, implementing and even execution, audit and impact assessment of such programs and schemes, and follow up corrective action to address the gender disparities, right? So all these things forms part of the gender budgeting, and gender budgeting would takes into consideration different things which are related to women. And in fact, gender budgeting is considered as a powerful tool. It is one of the powerful tool for achieving the gender mainstreaming, so as to ensure that the benefits of development reach women as much as men. And it would also result in inclusive development because it fosters more balanced and sustainable development, wherein equal participation and opportunities for women are adequately addressed. So addressing the equalities or inequalities is also very important aspect, because education, in terms of education, India ranks 125 out of 159 in gender inequality index, particularly women education. And in terms of political inequality, women MPs in 18th Lok Sabha was just 14 percentage, substantially lesser than most of the developing and even underdeveloped countries. And when we talk about the economic inequality, Global Gender Gap Report 2024 says India ranks 129 out of 146 countries. So that indicates that there's a huge gender gap in terms of wages for men and women. So India, in fact, has shown a dedicated will to bring changes by pledging to achieve these sustainable development goals, and these sustainable development goals have emphasized, or they have stressed on women, or development, all round holistic development of women as one of the very important factor. So that includes gender justice and even women empowerment as well. So that's how you could usually address this particular question, and that's all in this lecture. And thank you so much. So if you like our work, please subscribe our YouTube channel and also hit the like button. Thank you.